Hey folks, welcome to a very esoteric Sonic the Hedgehog video. Today I want to talk about Tails and his adventures in the Nameless Zone, a weird fantasy world created for the Fleetway comic books, inhabited by monsters and a whole civilization of foxes. This particular topic was requested by Sonic Toast, whose videos I really like. Thanks for an interesting suggestion. The Ken Penders era Archie comics are kind of famous for having a ridiculous amount of echidna characters and a large and confusing echidna family tree. That wasn't the case for the UK's 1990s Sonic comic, published by Fleetway. We only had 2 echidna characters, but what we did have is a whole lot of foxes. British comics usually consist of 4 to 5 really short individual comic strips, and that's exactly how Fleetway's Sonic the Comic functioned too. It allowed characters like Tails, Knuckles and Amy Rose to have their own adventures independent of Sonic. Tails got plenty of solo strips without Sonic, but in my opinion the most memorable ones all took place in this Nameless Zone. The Nameless Zone adventures left an impact on me as a kid, because one story in particular really scared me back then. Before we dive in, here's a brief explanation of Tails' background in the Fleetway comics. According to the 1994 Summer Special magazine, Tails was born and raised in the mysterious Nameless Zone, but left to make his fortune in Emerald Hill Zone, which he mistakenly believed was a zone actually paved with emeralds. This is kind of interesting because we never actually see any of this. Tails had been a part of the comic since issue 2 and never got an official introduction. At one point we do get to see a flashback of his first meeting with Sonic, where Sonic saves him from drowning, but that's about it. So with that introduction out of the way, let's see what the Nameless Zone is all about. The first time Tails visits was in the 2-part story aptly named The Nameless Zone. The story starts with Tails being horribly abused, as he often is, by Sonic. A large green portal opens up that beckons Tails to enter. He does so reluctantly and is greeted by 2 older foxes in medieval costume called the Enchanter Kings. It turns out that this weird zone is inhabited by foxes that look just like Tails. The Kings are thrilled to see Tails, recounting how he's been sending home letters of his heroic exploits on Mobius, along with his trusty assistant, Sonic. It turns out Tails has been lying to his fellow foxes about his fame and fortune on Mobius, painting himself as Mobius's greatest hero. It kind of reminds me of Luigi, exaggerating his exploits in Paper Mario Thousand Year Door. Anyway, Tails has been brought back to put on some battle armor and protect the Nameless Zone from the fierce monster berserker called Trogg. What a name. Tails and Trogg are to duel on the rickety dimension bridge that separates the Nameless Zone from the land beyond, which is inhabited by all sorts of horrible monsters. If Tails loses, the Nameless Zone is doomed. At this point, Tails really regrets sending those letters back and wishes that Sonic were around to help him out. But mid-fight, the dimension bridge gives way under the weight of Tails and Trogg, and thanks to the power of flight, Tails flies to safety, having seemingly left Trogg to fall to his doom. Despite his lies, Tails emerges from his first adventure in the Nameless Zone a true hero, thanks to his 2 trusty tails. Tails' next trip is the more substantial 4-part story, The Land Beyond. It starts with this wonderful view of a lonely pagoda surrounded by mountains. Tails is summoned back to the zone to undertake another dangerous task. This time he's asked to save the 3rd Enchanter King, She-Rob. Tails and the Enchanter Kings recall that She-Rob, a hero of old, went missing long ago, prior to Trogg's first attack on the Nameless Zone. Presumed dead, She-Rob is now believed to have been taken prisoner by Trogg instead, because his image appeared in the mysterious Crystal of Communication. Very fantasy-like. For this quest, Tails is assigned a guide and assistant called Errol Blackthorn, a larger fox and a much more competent warrior. Tails and Errol cross the dimension bridge into the Land Beyond, which is basically a Mordor-style wasteland. After a little skirmish with some monsters, Tails comes clean to Errol and tells him that he's been lying about his Mobian heroism the whole time. Errol is, of course, pretty disappointed and duty-bound to tell the other foxes about this deception, but Tails' flying abilities come in handy again, saving himself and Errol from a nasty fall, which gains him some respect. Tails and Errol find Sherob chained up in a dark cave. They free him, and in the process enrage the quite intimidating pit beast who intended to eat Errol for dinner. Tails manages to defeat the beast via a stroke of good luck when the beast smacks his head on the cave roof when pursuing him. Then, the truth comes out. Sherob reveals himself to be none other than Trogg, back again and seeking revenge on Tails for his prior humiliation. It turns out that Trogg actually is Sherob, and was transformed into this horrible creature when he made contact with the devilish evil one, a demonic-looking fox. Enraged, Tails launches an unsuccessful attack on Trogg, but is saved from certain death when he's suddenly beckoned home by the Enchanter King's portal. The story has a nice ending because Errol, impressed with Tails' courage, decides not to snitch on him to the rest of the foxes, though of course Trogg remains at large, the story somewhat unresolved. Tails' third Nameless Zone adventure was the Morbidden Hunt storyline, illustrated this time by Jose Casanovas, as opposed to Dave Windert. Casanovas' style is much more detailed, and this is the story that scared me as a kid. Tails is enticed through the green portal by a new character called Shaman Warple, and entrusted with saving two young foxes, Jimmy and Jilly, from the clutches of a horde of goblins who have them held hostage in Castle Morbidden. Now this story made an impact on me because the Goblin Queen, Vulpecula in particular, is always drawn by Casanovas to look pretty disgusting and barbarous. She's definitely Tails' most gruesome adversary. Tails goes through a lot on his way to Castle Morbidden. He narrowly escapes from a fierce griffin and befriends a village of centaurs. Before he makes his way to the castle, he's intercepted by Goblin Prince Catullus, brother of Vulpecula, who reveals something surprising. The young foxes are actually being treated pretty well by the hideous goblins. Lulled into a false sense of security, Tails, Jimmy and Jilly are taken to Queen Vulpecula to play a game of hide-and-seek in Castle Morbidden, a game that turns out to be a fatal fox hunt. It's worth noting that fox hunting was both legal and controversial in England and Wales at the time. I don't know whether this story is a commentary on that or not. Tails, Jimmy and Jilly try their best to hide in the castle, but the Queen knows it much better than them and finds them quite easily. But to be completely fair, Tails and the kids only escape because the Queen lets them have another go at hiding when she finds them. Very generous of her. Tails and the kids do eventually find their way out, and Tails flies them to safety, saving the day once again. That brings us to the longest Nameless Zone adventure, drawn this time by Nigel Kitching and starring Knuckles too. This is the Revenge of Trogg. How does Knuckles end up in the Nameless Zone? Well, he sees Tails entering an ominous green portal and dives in behind him, mistakenly believing he's being kidnapped. Shaman Warple mistakes Knuckles for Sonic, Tails' bumbling assistant, and humorously, Knuckles has no idea who Miles is. Miles per hour is of course Tails' real name, and that's what all of the foxes always refer to him as. I guess Knuckles has probably never heard Tails' real name before. This time around, the two Enchanter Kings have been kidnapped. Errol was sent to rescue them, but returned from the land beyond, transformed into a horrible monster. Errol explains that Trogg made him strong, turning him into this beast. Knuckles' strength comes in handy when battling the beastly Errol, and, humouring Tails and the foxes, Knuckles plays along and admits to being Tails' assistant Sonic. Knuckles is a true friend. After dispatching Errol, Knuckles and Tails head over to the land beyond. They're joined by Moraine Blackthorn, Errol's courageous and fiery sister. Watching their every move like Sauron is Trogg. Kitchen's version of Trogg is a giant hulking beast. In all honesty, not as menacing as Trogg's past incarnations in my opinion. Trogg's goblin forces overwhelm the heroic trio and bring them to his castle, where he has the two Enchanter Kings captive, ready to transform them into beasts too. With the power of a black orb and the full moon, he summons the help of the mysterious force known as the Dark One. The Dark One traps the heroes with some sort of energy attack and transforms the two Enchanter Kings into monsters. The transformation takes up most of the Dark One's power, allowing the heroes to escape Trogg's lair and steal the Black Orb when no one's looking. Tails throws the Black Orb off the Dimension Bridge, banishing the Dark One, and in the process, transforming the Enchanter Kings and Errol back into their foxy forms. After a short delay, the monstrous Trogg is also transformed back into She-Rob, the third Enchanter King, and with that, Tails and Knuckles triumphantly return to Mobius. What's interesting about this is that the Enchanter Kings would appear again, but without She-Rob. I always wondered what happened to him, and came to the rather dark conclusion that maybe he was executed by the other foxes. Is that a little bit too dark for a Sonic comic? After that long adventure, the Nameless Zone stories would slow down, and most of Tails' adventures would take place on Mobius. It'd be 3 years before readers would return there with a one-off story called First Flight, illustrated by Rob Corona. This is a really fun one-off story because it's from Tails' pre-Sonic days. Tails is the victim of bullying, picked on by 2 older foxes for having 2 tails. Yes, Tails is unique amongst the foxes, nobody else has this trait. The bullies are suddenly attacked by 2 flying bat warriors who are on the hunt for slaves. Tails tries to help, but trips and falls off a cliff, only to find himself instinctively using his 2 tails to fly. He's able to save his former tormentors, and has gained confidence in his newly discovered power of flight. A confidence that no doubt led him to come to Mobius. That leads us swiftly on to the final Nameless Zone story that took place during Fleetway's dying days, a 2-part story called The Goblin Overlords, illustrated by Nigel Dobin, my favourite artist who worked on Sonic the Comic. This time it's Moraine who summons Tails for his final adventure, and guess what? The Enchanter Kings have gotten themselves kidnapped once again by the goblins. This time around, the Fox Village is quite quiet, and a giant goblin fortress has been built really close. It seems as if the goblins have completely taken over. Tails and Moraine make a plan to break into the goblin stronghold at night. They do so, and they find the 3 Enchanter Kings inside, looking quite comfortable, and chatting with the new Goblin King Rubel. It turns out that Rubel is a bit of a shrewd, old-school politician. He's here to strike a peace deal with the Enchanter Kings. The goblins and foxes will be at peace, as long as the Enchanter Kings pledge their allegiance to him in a yearly ceremony. The Enchanter Kings are all for this deal, but the fierce Moraine isn't happy about it at all, and launches herself at Rubel's goblin guards. Tails and Errol jump in to brawl too, but ultimately the story ends really abruptly and inconclusively, as the magic portal suddenly sucks Tails back to Mobius, leaving the fate of the Nameless Zone unknown. The end of this strip promises that Tails and Moraine will reunite in 1999, but it wasn't to be. Not long after this final Nameless Zone story, the rapid decline of Sonic the Comic began. As of 1998, Fleetway had already started reprinting 1 old strip per comic, but it wasn't long before all but 1 comic strips were reprints. In the summer of 2000, the whole comic book consisted of reprints, with the only new material being the cover art. Unfortunately, we never got to see a resolution to the ongoing Fox and Goblin conflict, and never got to see Moraine ever again. As I often say, Sonic the Comic has continued online, with new issues infrequently put together by enthusiastic fans. The online comic has gotten some recognition from former Sonic the Comic writers and artists, which is cool, but I won't comment on it too much now, I'll save that for a future discussion. Ultimately, the Nameless Zone was a bizarre but fascinating chapter in my personal history of being the Sonic fan. The stories, though fun, never answer questions about Tails' past, which always confused me. I always wondered if the writers had plans to introduce some of Tails' actual family at some point in time. Ultimately, I really cherished these stories because I got to see Tails blossom from being really quite cowardly to being totally courageous. I've always kind of wondered what a Sonic game set in a fantasy medieval world might look like, When I finally saw it in Sonic and the Black Knight, it was a pretty big letdown. I wasn't a huge fan of that game. Nevertheless, I do think that that kind of setting has the potential to make a return in a future Sonic game. Ultimately, that brings my retrospective of the Nameless Zone to a close. What do you think about how Fleetway handled Tails' character, and how do you think it compares with his characterization in the Archie comic books, the various cartoon series, and the various different games? Thanks for watching this retrospective, and hopefully, I'll see you next time.